Start over. My guests will be here soon. The woman kneeling on the marble floor looked up, her fingers gone numb from the cold water. Ma'am, I've been scrubbing since noon. Just 10 minutes. From the top of the staircase, the other voice came down, sweet and cold at the same time. Rest? You think I pay you to sit and catch your breath? When you finish the floor, go to the kitchen. By hand, don't touch my washing machine. I haven't eaten anything since morning. You eat when the work is done. And remember one thing. In this house, you own nothing, not even your own time. Delia Novak lowered her head, dipped the rag back into the dirty water, and said quietly, almost only to herself, "One day the truth will speak louder than my tears." The woman standing on that staircase owned a mansion on Federal Hill, a diamond ring on her left hand, and a smile that convinced all of Providence her life had never known a single hard day. 5 years ago, in a hospital storeroom at 11 o'clock at night, a man went down and never got back up. The one who confessed was that woman's fiancé, one of the most powerful men on the East Coast. The innocent woman scrubbing her floors is the only living witness, and this afternoon, 200 miles away, the steel gate of a federal prison swung open. Rocco Vitale stepped down onto the curb, stood still for a moment in the sunlight, and started walking toward his own house. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like so we'll know you're listening. Share it with someone who believes that the truth will always find its voice in the end. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the stories still to come. 5 years earlier, on a November night, the emergency department at St. Aldegand Hospital blazed with light like a ship whose engines never shut down. Delia Novak stepped out of room number 4, peeled the gloves from her wrists, and looked up at the shift board hanging beside the nurse's station. Her name was on the 2nd line, then it was on the 3rd line too. She had been standing in that hallway since 7 o'clock the night before. It was now nearly 3 in the morning. Around the heel of one of her white nursing shoes was a band of gray tape, wrapped twice, with one corner already coming loose. She bent down, pressed it flat again, then stood and kept walking. Those shoes should have been replaced back in the summer, but every time she opened her wallet to buy a new pair, she thought of the brown envelope lying in the drawer at home. The envelope with the bold, printed words reminding her that the hospital debt was still there, untouched, and still waiting. So she closed her wallet again. Tape was cheaper than shoes. In an emergency room, no one ever looked down at another person's feet. Delia worked nights because the night shift paid $1.25 more per hour than the day shift. She worked a second shift in a row because consecutive shifts paid time and a half. Every week, she took 3 extra nights no one else wanted, and whenever the schedule went up on the wall, her name was always written into the hours everyone else avoided. People in the department called her the girl who never went home. She heard them, smiled, and kept moving. 3 years earlier, her husband had worked in the same field, in the passenger seat of an ambulance assigned to the east side of the city. One rainy night, his ambulance took a turn on 9th Avenue and never came out of it. Delia had been 4 months pregnant at the time. That was all she ever told anyone. And she told it only once, to Harriet Cobb, on the night Harriet found her sitting in the changing room with her head in her hands. After that, she never spoke of it again, and no one asked. Harriet Cobb had been the head nurse on the night shift for 26 years. She was the kind of woman who could look down a hallway full of people and know at once who was about to collapse. At 3:15 in the morning, she stopped Delia just outside the supply room. "Go home." Delia didn't break stride. "There are still 2 hours left in the shift. Your shift ended at 10 o'clock last night. What you're working now belongs to somebody else, and you picked it up. They need people. They always need people." Harriet planted herself in front of the door. "You've been standing here for 19 hours. I counted." Delia lifted her eyes to Harriet, and for 1 second, all the exhaustion showed on her face. Then she swallowed it down as though it were nothing more than a mouthful of water. "You tell me to go home, but what am I supposed to do there? Go home and lie in bed staring at the ceiling?" Harriet fell silent. It was the only thing Delia had ever said to her about what the nights were like inside her home. "Junie's asleep at my house," Harriet said softly. "She slept well, finished her whole bowl of porridge, and made me draw a cat on the back of her hand." This time, Delia truly smiled. "She makes everyone draw one. She draws better than I do." "That's true." The two women stood there for a few more seconds, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the steady beeping of a heart monitor drifting from the next room. Then Harriet sighed and stepped aside. She knew she wasn't going to win. She only wanted Delia to know that someone was keeping count. At 3:40, the automatic doors gave a sharp hiss. The green light on the ceiling flashed twice. The wheels of a stretcher struck the threshold, fast and heavy, with no siren to announce its arrival. The ambulance had shut the siren off outside the gate. Delia turned and went straight toward it, her hand already reaching for the box of gloves before she had even seen the patient clearly. On the stretcher lay a tall, broad man, his dark shirt soaked nearly black across the left side of his waist, his face drained of color, his lips pressed tightly together, his eyes still open. The paramedic called out the vital signs in a rapid voice. Delia listened, nodded, and asked the question she always asked. Name? The paramedic shook his head. No identification. Family? Unknown. Who called? We don't know that either. When we arrived, someone was already standing there waiting. The stretcher rolled into room number 2. Delia cut open the patient's sleeve, started an intravenous line, and prepared the tray. She did everything in the same order she had followed thousands of times before, and her hands didn't tremble once. The man on the stretcher was still watching her. He didn't groan. He didn't speak. He only watched. And as she drew the blue curtain closed behind her, she noticed that out in the hallway, about 3 steps from the door, 2 men in dark coats were already standing there, though she hadn't seen them arrive. They asked no questions. Neither of them approached the nurse's station to register. They simply stood there, one to the left of the door and one to the right, their arms resting at their sides, their eyes fixed on the curtain, and they remained in those exact positions for the next 4 hours. Inside room number 2, Delia worked beneath the white lights and said nothing except what was necessary. She cut away the wet fabric, cleaned the wound, and stitched the tear in his left side with the same even precision someone might use to sew the edge of a garment. The heart monitor kept beeping in a steady rhythm. The man on the table didn't groan, didn't close his eyes, and didn't ask what she was doing. He only watched her hands. Delia knew he was watching her. She also knew that wound hadn't come from a fall, a workplace accident, or some machine inside some factory. She had worked the night shift in the emergency department for 4 years. Some wounds carried their own histories and told them without being asked, but she didn't ask. She didn't ask who had done it to him, where it had happened, or who the 2 men standing outside the curtain were. She asked only 3 questions, and all 3 were about his body. Was he allergic to any medication? When had he last eaten? Did it hurt here or here? When she tied the final knot, the man spoke for the first time, and his voice made her pause slightly. Not because it was loud, but because it was the opposite. It was so quiet that she had to tilt her head to hear him. Your hands don't shake. Delia set the scissors down on the tray. I've seen worse. How much worse? She pulled off her gloves, dropped them into the bin, and answered in the calm voice of someone reading a shift schedule. Some nights, 3 ambulances arrive at once. You only have a tear, and you've lost less than half a liter of blood. Around here, we call that an easy night. The man was silent for several seconds. Then the corner of his mouth moved slightly, almost like a smile, but not quite. What's your name? Delia reached for the chart hanging at the foot of the bed, wrote several lines on it, then hung it back in place. Get some rest. A doctor will come examine you again in 4 hours. She opened the curtain and walked out. She didn't answer his question, and he didn't ask a second time. At 7 o'clock that morning, when Delia walked through the hallway to leave, room number 2 was empty. The sheets had been smoothed flat. The 2 men in dark coats were gone as well. On the bedside table was a sheet of paper folded into quarters. Inside were exactly 3 words. Thank you, miss. With no signature beneath them. Delia read it, folded it again, slipped it into the pocket of her coat, and forgot it was there until the paper disintegrated in the washing machine 2 weeks later. 3 weeks after that, he returned. This time, he came through the main entrance, walking upright, without bandages and without anyone beside him. He waited at the far end of the hallway until Delia passed, then stepped toward her. I'm better now. I can see that. I came to thank you. You already thanked me with a note. He tilted his head, a little surprised that she remembered. Then he reached inside his coat, took out a thick envelope, and placed it on the nurse's station between them. Delia looked at the envelope. She didn't reach for it. Take it, he said. This is my job. The hospital already charged you. That money was for the hospital. This is for you. Then I wanted even less. He looked at her for a long time. In his world, People gave him something and received something in return. That was the rule he had lived by for 20 years. But this woman was pushing the envelope back toward him with 2 fingers, as gently as though she were sliding away a dirty tray. "I stitched you because that's my job," Delia said. "If I take money, it becomes something else. I don't want it to become something else." He picked up the envelope, returned it to the inside pocket of his coat, and gave a single nod. "Rocco Vitali," he said. Delia looked at him. She knew the name. Everyone in Providence knew the name, though very few people said it aloud. "I know who you are," she replied, "and you stitched me anyway. In here, I don't stitch names. I stitch wounds." This time, Rocco Vitali truly smiled, and the smile made him look nearly 10 years younger. He lifted one hand to straighten his cuff, and Delia saw the watch on his wrist, an old steel watch with a crystal scratched into faint cloudy circles, its band worn so thin that the metal beneath was showing through. It didn't match the clothes he was wearing at all. It was the sort of watch a wealthy man would never wear unless it had once belonged to someone else. "Stay exactly as you are," he said as he turned away. "There aren't many people left in this city who refuse money." That evening, in the back room of a bakery on Atwell Street, Rocco Vitali sat across from a 74-year-old man named Ottavio Sabatini, who had occupied that same chair since Rocco's father was still alive. 3 sheets of paper lay on the table between them. Rocco pushed them toward the old man. "Something has been moving through the city for the past 3 months. It's moving under our family name." Otto put on his glasses and read slowly, his lips moving with each line. "What kind?" "Painkillers. Prescription drugs." Otto removed his glasses. He understood better than anyone why those words carried such weight. He had stood beside Gaetano Vitale at his wife's funeral 30 years earlier, when Rocco had been only 11 years old, and had remained beside the coffin without crying, one small hand gripping the sleeve of his father's coat. They had found his mother in the bathroom, with an empty bottle beside her. From that night forward, there had been one law inside the Vitali family that no one was ever allowed to touch. "Your father would burn this whole neighborhood to the ground if he were still alive," Otto said. "My father isn't alive, so this belongs to me now." Rocco rose, tapped 2 fingers against the papers, and said, "Find out for me. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell Nico, and don't tell anyone at the table. I want to know who's opening the door and letting that poison into my house." Otto folded the 3 sheets, placed them inside his coat, and answered in the slow voice of a man who had lived long enough to understand that the truth was rarely found where people expected it to be. "I'll find out, but you need to prepare yourself, Rocco. The door to one's own home usually isn't opened by a stranger." Renata Cardoni had a habit that everyone remembered after meeting her for the first time. Whenever she spoke to someone, she always touched their arm, lightly, only once, and accompanied the gesture with a smile that made them believe they had just been chosen from the crowd. At the city's charity galas, people called her the Flower of Federal Hill. She knew every man's wife's name, remembered every child's birthday, and never allowed anyone to leave without first asking after them. In front of Rocco, she became an entirely different woman. She poured his coffee, straightened his collar, and sat listening to him talk about business with the attentive expression of a wife who had learned to live with her husband's silence. On nights when he came home late, she left the kitchen light on. On mornings when he rose early, she woke before him, and when he asked whether she wanted him to walk away from everything in 2 years, she placed her hand over his and told him that all she needed was for him to come home every night. That was enough. Rocco believed her. He believed her so completely that he never saw what happened behind his back once the door closed. With the household staff, Renata Cardoni's voice dropped by 2 degrees. She didn't shout. She had never raised her voice at anyone. She merely spoke in the calm tone of someone reading from a list, and that list was always longer than the number of hours in the day. The diamond ring on her left hand had belonged to Rocco's mother. He had slipped it onto Renata's finger during a dinner at home, and she had cried at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right amount, and in exactly the right way. From that day forward, she never took it off. Not when she washed her hands. Not even when she slept. Some people wore rings as though they were wearing a promise. Others wore them as though they were hanging up a sign. Delia Novak met Renata Cardoni only once, and the encounter lasted less than 20 seconds. It was a December afternoon in the 3rd-floor hallway of St. Aldegand Hospital, when Delia was pushing a medication cart toward the end of the corridor. Renata stepped out of the elevator carrying a large bouquet, accompanied by another woman. The two of them stopped directly in the middle of the passage to finish the conversation they had already begun. Delia stopped and waited. Neither woman noticed her. She cleared her throat. Renata turned, looked Delia over from head to toe, then moved aside by exactly half a step, just enough for the medication cart to squeeze past, without forcing her to leave the place where she stood. During that half step, the two women's eyes met. Renata said nothing. Delia said nothing either. The cart rolled past, its wheels rattling over the tile floor, and the conversation behind Delia resumed from the exact point where it had been interrupted. But Delia had seen that face beneath the hallway lights, clearly and from close range, and it was the kind of face a person remembered without having to try. She remembered it for the next 5 years. As for Renata Cardoni, she remembered too. When she returned home that evening, and Rocco asked where she had been, she told him she had visited a sick aunt on the 3rd floor, then added that the hospital had lately been hiring nothing but exhausted-looking people, and that one nurse pushing a medication cart had looked as though she had just come in from plowing a field. Rocco laughed and thought nothing of it. From that day forward, whenever Renata mentioned that woman, she always called her by the same 3 words, that nurse woman. She never used her name, not even later, not even after she knew exactly what that name was. That winter, Delia began to notice something. She worked the night shift, and the night shift was responsible for counting the controlled medication cabinet. Every time someone removed an ampule, that person had to sign the ledger, record the time, the patient's name, and the batch number. At the end of the shift, the number of ampules remaining in the cabinet had to match the ledger. It was the dullest task of the night, and Delia had done it for 4 years without ever finding anything worth mentioning. Until one night in January, when she finished counting and discovered that 2 ampules were missing. She counted again. 2 were still missing. She opened the ledger, checked every line, and found 2 signatures at the bottom of the page, both recorded at 2:10 in the morning, with the names of 2 patients she remembered clearly, because both of them had been discharged the previous afternoon. Delia stood in front of that wide-open cabinet for a long time. Then she closed it, told no one, and brought a small notebook with her the following night. She began to write things down. Date, time, number of ampules. Signature. Over 6 weeks, she recorded 41 entries. 41 times when the numbers didn't match. The discrepancy was never large. Only 1 or 2 ampules each time. Small enough that no one would notice. Regular enough that when she added them together on a paper napkin in the changing room, the final number sent a chill along her spine. On the night she handed the notebook to Harriet Cobb, Harriet read it once, then read it a second time, then placed it on the table, and looked at Delia with the expression of someone who had just realized what she was holding in her hands. "Have you told anyone yet?" "No, don't say anything yet." Harriet stood, locked the break room door, and took the copy room key from her pocket. At 2 o'clock that morning, the 2 women stood inside a small room in the basement and copied every page from 6 weeks of dispensing records, 1 page at a time, without missing a single sheet. The copying machine hummed through the night. Harriet divided the copies into 2 stacks, handed one to Delia, and kept the other for herself. "I'll hide this one," she said. "You hide the other. Don't keep them in the same place. Don't leave yours at the hospital." 3 days later, Delia submitted a report to the head of the pharmacy department. That afternoon, she was walking down the stairwell in Section B, when Wesley Crane stepped out from the landing below and stopped in the middle of the stairs, blocking her path. He was 45 years old, still holding her report in one hand, and his voice was very polite. "Miss Novak, I've read it." Delia stopped, one hand resting on the railing. "And what do you think?" "I think I see a young, hard-working person who may be moving a little too quickly." He folded the report in half. "Records are sometimes wrong. People forget to write things down, enter the wrong information, or fail to sign. It happens in every hospital in this country. 41 times isn't an oversight." Crane smiled. There was nothing openly threatening in his smile, and that was precisely what made it frightening. "How long did it take you to earn that degree? The tuition, the examinations, the years you spent working as an aide before you were allowed into the emergency department?" 11 years. 11 years. He nodded thoughtfully, as though he had just heard a particularly beautiful number. "Don't turn them into 11 wasted years, Miss Novak. In this place, People remember for a very long time who caused trouble, and they forget very quickly who was right. Delia didn't step back. She looked directly into his eyes and spoke in the same calm voice she used when reading vital signs aloud to a doctor. Then remember me. I'll submit it again on Monday. Delia submitted the report again on Monday, just as she had said she would. Then Tuesday passed, Wednesday passed, and nothing happened. No one called her in. No one asked her a single question. The controlled medication cabinet on the third floor was fitted with a new lock on Thursday morning, and a notice was taped to the door, stating that it was part of a routine upgrade procedure. From that day forward, the dispensing ledger matched perfectly. Not one ampule was missing. Not one line was out of place. Harriet Cobb read the end of shift inventory sheet on Friday, then slid it toward Delia and said quietly that when the numbers suddenly became too perfect, it didn't mean the problem had been fixed. It meant the problem had been hidden more carefully. Delia nodded. She still kept her stack of photocopies inside a plastic bag, tucked between the 2 layers of the false bottom, in a drawer at home, beneath her daughter's winter clothes. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in early March, her phone vibrated at 10 o'clock. She was sitting on the living room floor, repairing the torn spine of a picture book. The number was unfamiliar, she answered. For the first 3 seconds, she didn't recognize the person on the other end, because his voice sounded nothing like the voice that had blocked her path in the Section B stairwell 2 weeks earlier. Miss Novak? Delia sat upright. Mr. Crane, do you still have that copy? She was silent. I'm asking you honestly. I'm not trying to threaten you. Do you still have it? Why are you asking me that? There was breathing on the other end of the line, long and uneven. Behind it was the hum of the air conditioning in an empty hallway. A sound Delia had heard for 4 years and recognized at once. He was inside the hospital, somewhere no one else was around. Listen to me, Crane said, and his voice dropped very low. You were right. You were right from the beginning. I have another ledger, not the one you copied. That was only the surface. Give it to the police. I can't. Why? Because someone there is involved. Delia stood. In the next room, her daughter was asleep, one hand still gripping the corner of her blanket. Delia stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind her. What do you want from me? I want you to come here. The basement pharmacy storage room, 11 o'clock. I'll give you the ledger, the names, the dates, the account numbers, everything. Then you leave this city. You have a young child. You can go. I can't. Why me? There was silence for a moment. Then Crane said the sentence Delia would remember forever, because it was the only thing in that entire phone call she believed immediately, because you're the only person in that hospital who doesn't owe anyone anything. I need someone outside this to know the truth. If someone else knows, they'll have to think carefully before they do anything to me. Do you understand? You're my insurance. Delia looked down at her hand. She had meant to say no. She had opened her mouth to say no, but then she thought of the 41 entries in the notebook, the new lock on the third-floor cabinet, and the way people closed a matter by making it look neat and orderly. 11 o'clock, she said. The back entrance. Don't use the elevator. She called Harriet Cobb twice. Both calls went to voicemail because Harriet was on duty and had left her phone in her locker. Delia left a one-line message, put on her coat, crossed the hall, and knocked on the elderly neighbor's door to ask her to watch the little girl for an hour. The old woman opened the door, nodded, and asked no questions, because everyone in that building knew the nurse on the second floor was sometimes called away in the middle of the night. Delia reached the hospital at 10:50. She entered through the back door, took the stairs down, and walked along the basement corridor toward the pharmacy storage room. Only half the basement lights were turned on at night. Every other bulb was dark, creating alternating stretches of light and shadow that ran the length of the hallway. She was about 15 steps from the storage room when she stopped. The door wasn't closed. It stood open by a gap about the width of a hand, and voices were coming through it. Delia remained still. Crane's voice was higher than usual, urgent. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for a guarantee. Another voice answered, a woman's voice, so calm that she might have been discussing the weather. You already have a guarantee. You've been living comfortably for 3 years. For 3 years, I've signed every line. Every single line. Do you understand? If this falls apart, they'll find my signature, not yours. Then don't let it fall apart. It already has. Someone submitted a report twice. There was silence for several seconds. Then the woman's voice came again, still without rising in the slightest. That matter has been handled. What did you handle? You changed the lock. You think changing a lock makes everything disappear? Footsteps moved around inside the storage room. Then Crane said the words that made Delia hold her breath. I have names. I have dates. I even have the night you stood in the parking lot with that man. If I go down, I'm not going down alone. People will learn who was behind all of this, and that name won't be Wesley Crane. Delia moved half a step closer and looked through the gap in the door. She could see part of Crane's back and, behind him, about 6 feet away, another figure. Small, a full head shorter than he was, standing perfectly still. The storage room light fell from above, and in that moment Delia saw a hand rise, the left hand, the fingers slightly curled inward, and something on the ring finger caught the light, flashing once before going dark again. She couldn't see the face clearly. That was all she saw. Then, behind her, at the far end of the hallway, came a very small sound, the scrape of a shoe sole against the tile floor. Delia turned. At that exact moment, every light in the corridor went out. Complete darkness descended, without a single line of light remaining. She heard footsteps, close, very close, and she managed to raise one hand. There was movement behind her. She staggered, struck the side of a metal filing cabinet standing against the wall, and the cabinet sent a deafening clang through the empty corridor. Then everything went silent. In that darkness, the final thing Delia Novak had time to think about before consciousness slipped away wasn't Crane, and it wasn't the left hand behind the crack in the door. She thought of her daughter, and of the promise she had made to the elderly neighbor, that she would only be gone for an hour. Rocco Vitale's phone vibrated at 11:27 that night. He was sitting in the office behind the bakery on Atwell Street, with 3 more sheets of paper in front of him that Otto Sabatini had sent over that afternoon. Renata's name appeared on the screen. He answered, and the first thing he heard wasn't a voice but breathing, broken and hurried, like someone who had run a very long way. You have to come here, right now. Where are you? The hospital, the basement. Please come. I don't know what to do. Rocco was already on his feet before she finished speaking. The drive took him 11 minutes. He entered through the back door, went down the stairs, and when he stepped into the basement corridor, every light had been turned back on, white and cold, exposing every stain on the tile floor. The pharmacy storage room door stood wide open. Renata was leaning against the wall, both arms wrapped around her elbows, trembling violently. Inside the storage room, Wesley Crane lay on his side beside the base of a shelf, motionless. Rocco looked inside for exactly 3 seconds, then turned to her. Tell me what happened. And Renata Cardoni told him. She spoke in a voice breaking apart piece by piece, saying that Crane had asked her to meet him there, that he knew something about Rocco's family and had demanded money, that she had gone alone because she didn't want to trouble him, that Crane had rushed at her, and that she had only thrown up one hand to push him away. That was all. Just once. Only one time. Tears ran down her chin and fell onto the collar of her dress. Rocco reached out, and she collapsed against his chest, like someone about to fall. 3 things caught his attention during the next 4 minutes. The first was the object beneath the shelf. When he bent down, picked it up, and turned it over in his palm, he recognized it immediately as his own. It was a short iron bar with leather wrapped around one end, something he kept in the desk drawer at home, something that had remained untouched in that drawer for 4 years. The second was what he saw when he stepped into the corridor and looked toward the corner of the ceiling. The warning light on the alarm system had turned red and was blinking at a steady rhythm, which meant the alarm had been triggered and the signal had gone out long ago, much earlier than Renata's call. The third came when he ran back toward the parking area to work out a way to get her out. He looked up and saw a camera mounted on a concrete pillar, aimed directly at the place where he had parked, and the small light beneath it was still on. Those 3 things stood beside one another in a perfectly straight line. Had Rocco Vitale looked at them that night with the same eyes he used to examine everything else in his life, he would have understood immediately. But he didn't look at them with those eyes. He looked at them through the image of a trembling woman clutching his coat. And inside his mind, every detail found its own explanation. She had taken the iron bar from his drawer because she was afraid to meet a blackmailer alone. She didn't know how to shut off the alarm. She had panicked and called him late, and people in a panic were slow to do everything. He told himself those exact 3 things, and they were enough to keep him from asking even one more question. Some men lost because they didn't have enough information. Rocco Vitale lost because he had all the information he needed and arranged it with his own hands into a story that was easier to bear. He called his men. They arrived 4 minutes later. And the first man through the door had spent 15 years cleaning up other people's problems. He walked through the area once, looked at the red light on the ceiling, looked toward the parking lot, then turned back and shook his head once. "It's too late, boss. The alarm has been running for 20 minutes. The police are already on their way. The parking lot cameras don't belong to the hospital. They belong to an outside security company, and I can't reach that system tonight. How much time? 6 minutes, maybe less." Rocco stood in the middle of that white corridor and calculated. He calculated quickly, as he always did. If the case went to open court, they would examine the hospital records. They would examine the dispensing ledgers. They would trace 3 years of drugs moving beneath the Vitale family name, the very operation whose owner he was still trying to find. They wouldn't find the person who had opened the door. They would only find the name hanging above that door, and that name belonged to his father. If Renata were prosecuted, she would have to explain why she had gone into the basement at 11 o'clock at night, and everything would begin rolling in a direction he could no longer stop. But if he took responsibility, it would become a fight between two men that had ended in death, simple, contained, and no one would need to open a single ledger. He had just finished the calculation when he heard a sound at the far end of the corridor. He turned and saw a woman sitting on the floor with her back against the side of a metal filing cabinet, one hand braced against the ground and the other holding the back of her head. She was trying to sit up and couldn't. Rocco walked toward her, and when he was 3 steps away, he recognized her. It was her, the woman who had stitched him without asking a single question. The woman who had pushed the envelope back toward him with 2 fingers. Delia Novak looked up at him, her eyes still unable to focus, and spoke in the hoarse voice of someone who had only just regained consciousness. "Where is Mr. Crane?" Rocco knelt in front of her. He didn't help her up. He only lowered himself until their eyes were level, and when he spoke, his voice was as quiet as it had been on the night he lay on the table in room number 2. "Listen to me carefully. The police will be down here in 4 minutes. If they find you here, they'll put your name in the file. Then they'll call you into court. Then they'll ask why you came down here tonight, who called you, and what you gave to whom. You have a young child. Do you understand how long that could follow you?" Delia looked at him. She opened her mouth to say something about the crack in the door, about the left hand, about the thing that had flashed on the ring finger. "I saw." "You didn't see anything." He said it very slowly. "You were never here tonight. Take the western staircase. Leave through the garage door, and go home to your daughter. Tomorrow morning, you'll wake up and you won't know what this basement looks like. That's the only thing I'm asking of you." He stood, held out his hand, pulled her to her feet, and kept hold of her elbow until she was steady. Then he turned away and walked toward the open storage room door. Behind him, Delia's footsteps faded along the tile floor. 4 minutes later, when the first 2 police cars pulled up outside the rear entrance of St. Aldegand Hospital and red and blue lights swept across the concrete wall, Rocco Vitale was standing alone in the middle of the pharmacy storage room, his hands resting in front of him, with the leather-wrapped iron bar lying on the floor beneath his feet. Renata Cardoni had left the building 3 minutes earlier. Inspector Dale Kowalczyk read Rocco Vitale's statement 3 times in a single morning, and every time he stopped at the same place. He was 63 years old, had spent 29 years in the Providence Police Department's Major Crimes Division, and in those 29 years, he had read enough confessions to know that guilty men said very little, while men confessing for someone else said exactly enough. This statement said exactly enough. It contained the time, the location, a description of the argument, what one man had said, and what the other had answered. It didn't contain one unnecessary word, and it didn't leave out a single one. Kowalczyk underlined one sentence in pencil, then pushed the file across the desk to his deputy. "What do you see?" "I see him taking responsibility for everything." "Exactly. He's taking responsibility for everything. He confessed quickly, cleanly, and without bargaining over a single thing." Kowalczyk tapped the tip of his pencil against the page. "A man like Vitale doesn't refuse to bargain unless he's buying something more valuable than the price he's paying. I want to know what that is." He requested authorization to obtain the parking lot camera footage. He requested a list of all incoming and outgoing calls through the hospital switchboard that night. He requested the recorded time when the alarm had been activated. 3 requests, all submitted on the same afternoon. The answer to the first was that the parking lot cameras were managed by a private company, and the data had already passed its retention period. The answer to the second was that the hospital needed time to process the request under patient privacy procedures. The third request received no answer at all. On the 11th day, his superior called him into the office, closed the door, and told him in the voice of a man reading from a page he hadn't written himself that the suspect had confessed. The attorneys on both sides had reached an agreement. The victim's family had filed no objection, and the case was closed. Kowalczyk asked whether he was allowed to enter his objection into the official record. His superior told him he could write whatever he wanted. So he did. 2 handwritten lines at the bottom of the final page. Then he signed his name and closed the file. He didn't know that 11 years later, those 2 lines would be the very thing that opened it again. Before the court hearing, Rocco Vitale was taken to a room behind a restaurant on Broadway Street, where there stood a round oak table at which his father had once sat. 11 men were seated around it. At the head of the table sat Don Silvio Aiello, 79 years old, both hands resting on the cane standing between his knees. Nico Ferraro sat to Rocco's right, and over the course of that evening, he placed a hand on Rocco's shoulder exactly 4 times. They discussed who would control what during the next 5 years. They discussed distribution routes, money, and the names that needed to remain clean. Rocco listened to all of it, nodded when a nod was required, and asked for nothing. At the end of the meeting, when Don Silvio asked whether he had any requests, the entire table fell silent and waited. They expected him to demand his share. They expected him to ask for guarantees for his fiancée, his home, and his money. Rocco Vitale placed both hands on the table and said only one sentence. There was a nurse at the hospital that night. She wasn't involved. No one touches her. No one speaks her name. During the 5 years I'm inside. If anything happens to that woman, I'll consider it my business when I come out. Everyone at the table looked at him. Nico Ferraro, seated to his right, raised one hand and slowly smoothed his tie from the knot down to his stomach. Don Silvio Aiello watched Rocco for a long time, then struck the tip of his cane against the floor once. Agreed. No one touches the nurse. That was the only condition Rocco Vitale placed on 5 years of his life. He asked for nothing for himself, nothing for Renata, and nothing for the house on Federal Hill. He purchased the life of a woman he had met only 3 times, and he believed he had taken care of the most difficult part. The court hearing took place on an April morning. There was no jury, no witness, and no argument. The attorney read the agreement. The judge asked whether the defendant understood it. Rocco said he did, and everything ended in 22 minutes. Manslaughter. 5 years. For security reasons, he wasn't held in Rhode Island, but was transferred to a federal prison in northern New Hampshire, 300 kilometers from Providence. At that facility, every visitor had to appear on a list approved in advance, and every letter sent to him had to pass through the prison review department. The person listed as Rocco Vitale's outside contact, the one who signed the documents, submitted the visitor lists, and received any returned letters, was his foster brother, Nicola Ferraro. Rocco himself had requested it. He believed it was the simplest arrangement. On the morning he entered the prison, reporters were waiting along the road because the case had appeared in the local newspaper for 3 days in a row. The vehicle carrying him passed through the steel gate, and the gate closed behind it with a heavy, dry sound. Renata Cardoni stood outside the fence with one hand holding a handkerchief to her face, her shoulders shaking in waves. A camera lens was pointed at her. She didn't look at the lens. She only stared toward the gate, and the tears running down her face were real. Everyone could see them. The following day, her photograph appeared on page 3, with a caption about the woman who was waiting. Then the reporters packed away their cameras. People returned to their cars. The vehicle carrying Renata traveled about 50 meters, turned away from the road leading to the prison, and at that exact bend, Renata Cardoni lowered the handkerchief from her face. She didn't wipe away her tears. She looked through the window at the rows of trees rushing backward behind her, and on her still wet face appeared a very small smile. So small that even if the driver had glanced into the rearview mirror at that precise moment, he would have believed he had imagined it. 3 weeks after the steel gate closed, Nico Ferraro called a meeting in the room behind the bakery on Atwell Street, sat in the very chair where Rocco had always sat, and presented a plan he called the New Direction for the next 3 years. Otto Sabatini sat at the corner of the table with one hand resting on his cane and listened from beginning to end. When Nico finished speaking, Otto was the only man in the room who didn't applaud. What did you just say? Nico smiled. He always smiled before he spoke. I said we're leaving money on the table, Uncle Otto. That product has been moving through this city for 3 years. It moves whether we want it to or not, so we'd be better off taking our share than letting the Fall River people swallow all of it. Do you know how many laws this family has? I grew up in this family. Have you forgotten? Then remind me of the first one. Nico raised a hand and slowly smoothed his tie from the knot down to his stomach. Laws are made by the living, Uncle. Mr. Gaetano has been dead for 11 years. Otto Sabatini rose to his feet. He was 74 years old and had to press both hands against the table just to stand. But once he was upright, the entire room fell silent. Rocco asked me to find the person who was opening the door and letting that poison into this family. I'm still looking, and I'm telling you now, I'm close to finding him. He looked around the table, studying every face one by one. Rocco still has 4 years and 9 months before he comes home. Until he does, that chair still belongs to him. 7 days later, Otto Sabatini didn't appear at the next meeting. People said he had fallen in the bathroom. They said his daughter had flown up from Florida, that a doctor had signed a document bearing the words cognitive decline, and that the family had decided to place him in a care facility in Woonsocket, 45 minutes outside the city. They said he could no longer remember anyone's name. No one in that room asked another question. Some silences spoke louder than declarations. During the 2nd month, Renata Cardoni moved into the house on Federal Hill. She told everyone the house needed someone to look after it, that leaving it empty would allow it to fall into disrepair, and that she was staying there to preserve it exactly as it was until Rocco came home. In the 3rd month, Nico Ferraro moved in as well. This time, no explanation was offered, and no one asked for one. On Federal Hill, people followed a simple rule. When asking about something would make everyone uncomfortable, it was better not to ask. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Delia Novak was counting the days. She had made a promise. She had left the basement that night through the western stairwell, just as the man had instructed, gone home, and sat on the floor of her daughter's bedroom until morning, watching the little girl sleep. She had read the newspaper and seen Rocco Vital's name on page 3. She had seen the photograph of the woman standing outside the fence with a handkerchief pressed to her face, and she had recognized that face immediately because she had seen it beneath the 3rd-floor hallway lights on a December afternoon. Delia remained silent for 1 month, then 2. But there was one thing she hadn't considered. Delia was a nurse. She had taken an oath, and during those 72 days, every time she passed the basement pharmacy storage room, every time she signed her name in a new dispensing ledger, filled with beautiful numbers that matched perfectly, she thought of the 41 entries in her notebook. She thought of the operation that was still running somewhere beyond those walls, and she wondered whose hands it would reach tomorrow. A man had died inside that storage room, and the man in prison wasn't the person who had been inside it. On Tuesday morning of the 13th week, Delia Novak put on her coat, picked up the plastic bag containing the photocopied pages, and walked to the Providence Police Department. She sat in an interview room for 4 hours. She told them everything. She told them about the phone call at 10 o'clock that night, the meeting arranged for 11, the partially open door, the calm female voice speaking to Wesley Crane, the figure standing a full head shorter than he was, the left hand rising, and the object that had flashed on the ring finger. She told them about the lights going out and the sound of a shoe sole behind her. She said she hadn't seen the woman's face, but she had heard the voice clearly, and she would recognize it if someone played it for her again. The officer taking her statement typed every word. He printed 3 pages. Delia read every line, then signed her full name at the bottom of the 3rd page in clear handwriting and wrote the date by hand. She left, and throughout the walk home that day, for the first time in 73 days, she felt lighter. She believed it was over. 21 days later, during the Friday night shift, 2 people from Human Resources and 1 member of hospital security came down to Section B and requested that nurse Delia Novak's personal locker be opened in the presence of 3 witnesses. She stood there and watched them open it. Inside, beneath her folded coat, was a clear plastic bag containing 17 ampules of controlled pain medication. The batch numbers matched those of the ampules reported missing during the final 6 weeks of the previous year. Delia stared at the bag and couldn't say a word. It wasn't because she was afraid. It was because, in that moment, she understood that someone had gone to the trouble of collecting ampules with those exact batch numbers, had kept them hidden for months, and had waited for precisely this day. Everything that followed happened quickly and with perfect order. Immediate suspension. The disciplinary committee met 9 days later. The state licensing board met 3 weeks after that. Delia was assigned a court-appointed attorney, a young and decent man, who told her during their first meeting that physical evidence found inside a locker bearing her name would be extremely difficult to dispute. She gave him the photocopied pages. He read them, nodded, and asked her one question she couldn't answer. How could they prove those pages had been copied months earlier rather than recently? The board permanently revoked her nursing license. Delia Novak's name was placed on the statewide list, barring her from employment anywhere in Rhode Island's healthcare system. 11 years of studying, examinations, working as an aide, taking night shifts, and standing in emergency rooms. It ended in 9 days. Harriet Cobb was the only person who spoke out. She wrote a 4-page letter to the hospital board, signed it, and delivered it personally without passing it through anyone else. In the letter, she stated that she had helped Delia photocopy those ledger pages, that she was prepared to testify, and that she had worked at that hospital for 26 years without ever writing a letter like it. She received no reply. 2 weeks later, the shift schedule posted on the wall carried her name on a new line. Night shift head nurse Harriet Cobb was reassigned to the Section C sanitation department. Night shift. Effective Monday. When June Novak was born, the doctors discovered that one of the valves in her heart didn't close completely, and they operated on her when she was only 11 days old. The surgery was successful. The doctor said it was the kind of valve that would have to be replaced again when she was older, around 7 or 8, when her body was strong enough. Delia remembered sitting in the hospital hallway that morning, 3 months after her husband's funeral, and thinking that 7 years was a long time, so long that she would surely have enough time to prepare. Her professional insurance had covered almost all of the first surgery. Almost all, but not everything. The remaining balance was $41,000, and over the next 3 years, she had paid off $12,000, steadily, every month, without missing a single payment. Then, she lost her job. The hospital transferred the debt to a collection company during the 2nd month after she stopped paying. From then on, she received 2 letters every month, and each one carried a small line printed in the bottom corner stating that the account was past due. When Junie was 5, the pediatric cardiologist examined her during a routine appointment and said that she was growing faster than expected, and that they might need to consider replacing the valve a little sooner. Delia asked about the procedure. They told her to go to the financial office. At the financial office, a kind woman looked up the records, then raised her eyes to Delia with the expression of someone about to say something she herself found unreasonable. Under hospital policy, patients whose accounts had been placed with a collection agency couldn't be scheduled for procedures that weren't emergencies until their financial records had been resolved or they had been approved for an assistance program. Delia asked how she could be approved. The woman handed her a packet 14 pages thick. Delia filled out every page, submitted it, and 4 months later received a letter saying that her application required additional documents proving income from an employer. She didn't have an employer. She had 3 jobs, and all 3 paid in cash. In the mornings, she delivered newspapers. She woke at 4 o'clock, walked to where she kept her bicycle, and covered 4 streets with a canvas bag nearly as large as she was. At midday, she cleaned houses, 2 a day, sometimes 3. In the evenings, she washed dishes at the Italian restaurant on Broadway Street, standing over a sink full of hot water from 5 o'clock in the afternoon until midnight. On nights when she worked a 2nd shift at the restaurant, Harriet Cobb came to pick up Junie. Harriet had been reassigned to the Section C sanitation department on the night shift, but her shift didn't begin until 11 o'clock, which gave her 3 free hours every evening. She came over, cooked the little girl a bowl of noodles, sat and listened to her stories, then read to her until she fell asleep. Sometimes Delia came home at midnight and found the 2 of them asleep together on the floor, surrounded by colored pencils. Harriet never accepted a single dollar. Once, Delia slipped money into her coat pocket. The next day, Harriet slipped it back into Delia's pocket, and after that, neither woman ever mentioned it again. Mother and daughter lived in a room behind a laundromat on Cranston Street. Delia had strung a small line of lights along the ceiling, the kind people hung during the holidays, bought from a discount store, and she turned them on every evening. Beneath those lights, the entire left wall was covered with Junie's drawings, fastened with paper tape, and arranged in careful rows from low to high, in the exact order in which she had made them. There was a picture of the cat Harriet had drawn on the back of the girl's hand, and that Junie had later copied. There was a picture of a house with a chimney. There was a picture of 3 figures standing beside one another, 2 large and 1 small, which Junie explained were her mother on the left, herself in the middle, and the rabbit she wished she had on the right. Every morning, Delia folded the blanket into a square and placed it at the foot of the bed, neat and precise in the way hospital blankets were folded, because 11 years of habit couldn't be undone. Junie's favorite game was counting. It had begun when she was very small, after the doctor said that whenever she ran or played too hard, she should be made to rest for a little while in between. Delia didn't tell her daughter that she had to stop. She turned it into a game. Junie ran, and while she ran, she counted aloud, 1, 2, 3, and her mother counted with her from behind. Whoever counted louder won. When they reached 30, they both threw their hands into the air and shouted as loudly as they could, "Time's up!" then collapsed onto the floor laughing. The little girl never knew it was a medical rule. She only knew it was the most wonderful game in the world, and she played it everywhere. She played it in the laundromat, running around the dryers while her mother waited for the clothes. She played it in the park. She even played it in the kitchen, running from the door to the refrigerator and back again, 3 meters each lap, counting so loudly that the woman who owned the laundromat out front had to poke her head in and ask what was happening. One October evening, Delia came home just before midnight, carrying a cardboard box of leftover food that the restaurant chef always saved for her. Harriet had already gone home. Junie was still awake. She was sitting in the middle of the bed, waiting. "Mommy, I finished drawing the rabbit. Let me see." She held up the page. The rabbit had 6 legs. Delia studied it with great seriousness. "This rabbit must run very fast." "It has 6 legs, Mommy." "Then does it count to 30 before it has to rest? Or does it count to 60? Junie thought for a moment, then announced with complete certainty that a rabbit with 6 legs should count to 90. Then she climbed down from the bed and began running around the table, counting loudly. 1, 2, 3. Delia set down the food box, took off her coat, and joined in. 4, 5, 6. Her hands were aching after 8 hours submerged in hot water. Tomorrow she would wake at 4 o'clock. In the drawer at the corner of the room were 3 letters from the collection company that she hadn't opened. But at that moment, beneath the small string of lights and the wall covered with drawings, she was running around a table with her daughter, and both of them were counting louder and louder. 28, 29, 30. Mother and daughter threw their hands into the air and shouted together. "Time's up." The federal prison in northern New Hampshire stood among a stretch of bare hills, and during the winter, the wind sweeping in from the forest crossed the exercise yard with such bitter cold that the inmates called it the freezer. Rocco Vitale was assigned to Block B, cell number 27, and during his first 3 weeks, he spoke to almost no one. People left him alone. Inside a prison, a name arrived before the man did, and his name had reached that place several days ahead of him. He took a job in the library. It was a room about 10 meters long, with 4 metal shelves, 2 tables, and an old man who sat in the farthest corner from 5 o'clock in the morning until the afternoon head count. His name was Walt Prebeck. He was 68 years old, serving a life sentence, had been inside for 31 years, and had looked after that library for 22 of them. He had a habit of speaking to books more often than he spoke to people, and the first thing he said to Rocco was to ask whether he knew how to arrange books by number. Rocco said he did. The old man nodded, and didn't ask him anything else for the next 4 months. In federal prison, inmates were allowed to register a list of relatives who could visit them and send them letters. That list had to be submitted by someone outside and approved by the administrative office. During the initial processing, an officer handed Rocco a form and asked whom he wanted listed as his primary contact. He wrote Nicola Ferraro's name. Then he added one more thing to the officer sitting across from him, something he had thought about throughout the 300-kilometer ride in the transport vehicle. He said he didn't want newspapers, didn't want magazines, and didn't want anyone calling to tell him what was happening outside. The officer looked up at him, slightly surprised, because inmates usually asked for more, not less. Rocco didn't explain. He couldn't explain that every message sent into the prison from Providence would leave a mark in a ledger, that every mark would become a thread connecting him to the name he wanted to keep clean, and that if someone someday decided to trace the old case, those were the very threads they would follow. He believed he was building a wall around Renata Cardoni. He didn't know that he had just covered his own eyes and stopped his own ears, and that the hand holding the cloth belonged to him. Nico Ferraro came to visit for the first time during the 2nd month. He sat on the other side of the glass wearing a gray suit and spoke for 20 minutes without saying anything specific. He asked whether Rocco was eating well, whether he was sleeping, whether anyone was troubling him. Rocco asked only one question. "How is she?" Nico raised a hand and slowly smoothed his tie from the knot down to his stomach. "Everything's fine. She's still waiting. Don't worry." The second visit came 4 months later. The same suit. The same 20 minutes. Rocco asked about Otto. Nico said the old man had grown weak, couldn't remember anyone anymore, and that his family had found a good place to care for him. Rocco was silent for a long time, then asked the familiar question. "How is she?" "Everything's fine. She's still waiting. Don't worry." The third visit came nearly a year later. This time, Nico arrived 20 minutes late and could stay for only 10 minutes because he had to catch a flight to Boston. Before he stood to leave, he repeated those same 3 sentences without changing a single word, and Rocco Vitali sat behind the glass watching him walk away without realizing that for almost 2 years, everything he knew about the woman he intended to marry had been contained in 11 words spoken by the same mouth. After the third visit, Nico never came again. During the second winter, Rocco couldn't sleep. He got up at 2 o'clock in the morning, asked the officer on duty for permission to go to the library, and sat at the wooden table beneath the only light still burning. He took a sheet of squared paper, the kind issued to inmates, and began to write. He wrote that he had no regrets. He wrote that on some nights he lay staring at the ceiling and calculated everything again from the beginning, over and over, and every time he arrived at the same conclusion, that if he could return to that basement, he would still do exactly what he had done. He wrote that he didn't need her to wait for him, but that if she did, then merely thinking about it would make him leave that place 3 years sooner. He wrote that she shouldn't send him anything, shouldn't write back, shouldn't visit, that she should simply leave things as they were, and that he would walk home by himself on the day the gate opened. He wrote a page and a half, folded it into thirds, and placed it inside an envelope. The following morning, he didn't send it through the prison mail, because letters sent that way would be opened, inspected, and entered into the records. He waited until the next visitation period, handed the envelope to one of his men to carry outside, and gave him a brief message. Put it directly into Nico's hand. Tell him to give it to her. Walt Prybeck had seen him folding the letter that night. He didn't ask anything then. 3 days later, while the two of them were rearranging shelf number 4, the old man finally spoke, though his eyes remained on the spines of the books. "You've been in here almost 2 years now, haven't you?" "Almost 2 years. I've noticed you haven't received a single letter." "I don't want any." "You don't want letters, don't want newspapers, and don't want anyone telling you what's happening outside." The old man pushed a book into its proper place. "I've been in here for 31 years. I've seen every kind of man. Men who want to forget the outside world sit differently. They sleep differently. But you wake up at 2 o'clock every night." Rocco didn't answer. "I'm guessing there's someone outside you're trying to protect." Walt Prybeck turned, and for the first time in 4 months, he looked Rocco directly in the face. "I only hope they know it. Because if they don't, then you're paying for something no one is receiving." Rocco Vitale lay awake until morning. He thought about those words for 3 nights, then pushed them aside, just as he had pushed aside the 3 strange details in the basement corridor 2 years earlier. 300 kilometers away in Providence, in the parking lot behind a restaurant on Broadway Street, Nico Ferraro sat inside his car, with one hand on the steering wheel and the opened letter in the other. He read it once from beginning to end. Then he read the middle section a second time, the part where Rocco wrote that if he could return to that basement, he would still do exactly what he had done. Nico sat motionless for about a minute. Then he lowered the window, flicked open a lighter, touched the flame to one corner of the paper, and held it outside the car until the fire licked close to his fingers. He dropped what remained onto the asphalt, watched it burn completely, then raised the window and drove away. Rocco Vitale was born on September 17th, and inside the prison, no one knew it except the administrative office. He never told anyone. In his 3rd year, on the afternoon of the 17th, while he was rearranging shelf number 2 in the library, Walt Prybeck walked past, placed half of a peanut candy bar on the table, then sat down in his chair and opened the lending ledger, as though nothing had happened. Rocco looked at the 2 broken halves of the candy bar. "How did you know?" "I've looked after this library for 22 years. When people leave records somewhere, I know where they are." Walt didn't look up. 35, right? 35. I came in here at 37. The old man turned a page. Eat it. Candy gets so old in here it turns as hard as stone. Rocco picked up one half. The candy was old. The sugar coating had begun to darken, and it had the sharp sweetness of something sold from the vending machines in the visitation area. He chewed slowly. Outside the library window, the September wind swept across the yard, carrying the first fallen leaves of the season along the fence. Somewhere at the far end of the block, someone laughed loudly. "Happy birthday, boss," Walt Prebeck said without looking up. It was the only birthday wish Rocco Vitale received that year, and he remained seated for a long while afterward, half a candy bar in his hand, thinking of the woman he believed was waiting for him 300 kilometers away. 300 kilometers away, on that same evening of September 17th, Federal Hill lit up a corner of the sky. Lights had been strung along the fence of the largest house on the street, wrapped around every tree trunk in the yard, and hung from the porch roof in long chains. Cars filled both sides of the road. From inside the house came the sound of live music, glasses touching, and the laughter of more than 100 people. It was the wedding anniversary celebration of Nicola Ferraro and Renata Cardoni. They had married the previous September in a small, private ceremony, and everyone present that day understood that it was better not to speak of it afterward. But 1 year was still 1 year, and on Federal Hill, people never missed an opportunity to hold a party. In the yard, a 3-tiered cake stood on a table covered with a white cloth. Beside the cake table, a woman in a long wine-colored gown stood at the center of a circle of guests, holding a glass in her left hand, and every time she laughed, everyone around her laughed too. On the ring finger of that left hand were 2 rings fitted together. The lower one was her wedding ring. The upper one had been there much longer, and it had belonged to Rocco Vitale's mother. Rain began falling at 9 o'clock. It wasn't heavy, only the fine, lingering rain of late summer, but it was enough to drive everyone inside, and enough to force the servers to run around to the back entrance whenever they carried anything. The event company had hired 6 extra temporary workers for the evening, paying them in cash, $14 an hour, from 6 o'clock until the cleanup was finished. One of those 6 workers was a 30-year-old woman with brown hair, tied back with a rubber band, and old athletic shoes on her feet. She had found the job through someone she knew at the restaurant where she washed dishes. They had given her only the address and the time she needed to arrive. They hadn't told her whose house it was, and she hadn't asked, because over the past 3 years, she had learned that people who paid in cash didn't like questions. For 3 hours, Delia Novak moved back and forth between the truck parked on the street and the kitchen door at the rear of the house. She carried trays out, carried trays back in, stacked dirty glasses inside plastic tubs, and wiped rainwater from the tiles in the backyard. She wasn't allowed to enter the areas where the guests were gathered. The manager had made that clear at the beginning of the evening. Temporary staff used the side entrance, didn't enter the main room, and didn't speak to guests. Delia followed those instructions exactly. A little after 10 o'clock, the rain grew slightly heavier. Delia carried a tub of dirty glasses outside, placed it on the step, and stood beneath the porch roof for several seconds to catch her breath. Her hands ached, her shoulders ached. Tomorrow, she would still have to wake at 4 o'clock to deliver newspapers. Inside the house, the music stopped, and someone began speaking into a microphone. Then the entire house started counting down. 3, 2, 1. Applause erupted, followed by cheering and the sound of glasses touching. Light poured from the windows into the yard, golden and warm, stretching across the wet tiles. Delia stood in the rain about 15 steps from that light and thought of her daughter sleeping in the room behind the laundromat beneath the small string of lights bought at a discount store. Then she bent down to lift the tub of glasses. As she straightened, she raised her head. On the pillar to the right of the gate, beneath the streetlight, a brass plaque displayed the house number. Delia looked at the number. She stood motionless for about 3 seconds. Then she set the tub down, stepped backward, and looked up at the entire front of the house, at the gate, the fence, and the chains of lights wrapped around the tree trunks in the yard. 3 years earlier, she had read that number on page 3 of a local newspaper, beneath a photograph of a man being led out of a courthouse. The article had included the address. She had read it many times, enough for it to remain in her mind like a nail driven into a wall. This was Rocco Vitale's house. Inside, the music began again. Through the large window, Delia saw people raising their glasses. She saw a woman in a wine-colored gown standing in the middle of the room turn toward the man beside her. and the man leaned down and kissed her hair while everyone applauded. The chandelier light fell across the left hand holding the glass, and something on the ring finger caught the light, flashed once, then disappeared. Delia Novak stood in the rain, one hand still gripping the handle of the tub filled with dirty glasses, and she recognized that face. She had seen it beneath the lights of the third-floor hallway on a December afternoon. She had seen it on page 3 of the newspaper, holding a handkerchief outside the fence of a prison, and she had heard that voice, calm as though it were discussing the weather, drifting through the partially open door in the basement of St. Aldegund Hospital. Behind her, the kitchen door opened, and the manager stuck his head outside and sharply demanded to know when the glasses would ever be finished if she left the tub sitting there. Delia turned. "Yes," she said. "I'm taking it out now." She lifted the tub and walked toward the truck with her head lowered, her steps steady, neither faster nor slower than before. But when she placed the tub inside the truck, her hands were trembling so badly that the glasses knocked against one another and rang through the rain. During the next 14 months, Delia Novak continued working the same 3 jobs and took on a 4th one that no one knew about. She began searching for a way into that house. She started with the easiest path. She accepted more shifts with the event company, including the jobs everyone else turned down, and each time she agreed to work, she asked for the address first. Over those 14 months, she returned to the house on Federal Hill twice more, and both times she entered through the side passage. Both times she was forbidden to step into the main room, and both times she saw the woman only through a window. She understood that even if she stood outside in the yard for another 10 years, she would never discover anything. Then, in the spring of that year, one of the cooks at the restaurant on Broadway Street mentioned that Mrs. Ferraro's house on Federal Hill had dismissed yet another housekeeper, the 4th one in 2 years, and that the woman who owned the house was so demanding that people had begun warning one another not to take the position. Delia asked for the employment agent's telephone number. She called on a Thursday afternoon, said she was looking for housekeeping work, and the agent asked whether she had any experience. She said 3 years. The agent asked where she had worked. Delia gave the names of 4 rental apartments she cleaned every week, and all 4 were true. The agent asked what she had done before that. Delia was silent for exactly 1 beat, then said she had previously worked in the service industry, and the person on the other end didn't ask anything more. The appointment was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following Tuesday morning at the house. That morning, Delia woke at 4 o'clock as she did every day, finished delivering the newspapers, returned home to bathe, and put on the finest clothes she still owned, an old but neatly pressed pale blue shirt. She stood before the small mirror in the room and looked at herself for a while, then removed the thin necklace from her neck and placed it inside the drawer. She thought about the way people would look at her, and she wanted them to see her exactly the way she needed to be seen. Junie was sitting on the bed eating bread and asked why her mother was dressed so nicely. "I'm going to ask for a job." "What kind of job, Mommy?" "Cleaning a lady's house." "Is she nice?" Delia tied her hair back again with a rubber band. "Probably not." The little girl giggled and said that in that case, her mother should count to 30 and then rest. Delia bent down and kissed her hair, and in that moment, she nearly changed her mind. But 14 months earlier, she had stood in the rain looking through that window, and 3 years earlier, she had signed her name on 3 pages at the police station, and neither of those things had led anywhere. She straightened and walked out the door. On the other side of the city that same morning, Renata Cardoni sat in the living room with the employment agent's file resting on her lap. She had read it the night before. The second line contained the applicant's full name and date of birth, and when Renata reached that name, she had placed the paper on the table, sat motionless for about half a minute, then picked it up and read it again. Renata Cardoni had an excellent memory for names. It was one of the things that had carried her from a girl working in a flower shop to the chair in which she now sat. She remembered that name from the document an acquaintance at the police department had shown her 3 years earlier. The document that was 3 pages long and carried a handwritten signature at the bottom of the 3rd page. She remembered the face, too. She had seen it only once. In the 3rd-floor hallway of St. Aldegund Hospital, a nurse pushing a medication cart who had cleared her throat to ask for room to pass. Over the past 3 years, Renata had ordered people to follow that woman 4 separate times, each time for several weeks, and then stop. They reported that she washed dishes, delivered newspapers, cleaned rented homes, and returned at night to the room behind the laundromat. They reported that she hadn't met with any lawyers, hadn't returned to the police station, and hadn't spoken with anyone of importance. Renata Cardoni had allowed herself to feel safe, but now only 8 months remained before Rocco Vitali would leave prison, and that name had suddenly walked to her front door on its own and asked for a housekeeping position. She sat for a very long time with the file on her lap. Then she called the employment agent and said to bring the woman at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. Some hunters preferred to wait inside the brush. Others preferred to open the cage door wide and sit inside the house, watching the prey walk in on its own. The interview took place in the small eastern sitting room and lasted 19 minutes. Renata Cardoni sat in an armchair. Delia Novak sat in the chair opposite her, her back straight and both hands resting on her lap. The employment agent stood by the door. "How long have you worked as a housekeeper?" 3 years. Before that? Before that, I worked in the service industry. Renata nodded, looked down at the file, then raised her eyes again. "This is a large house, 3 floors, 9 rooms, and 2 kitchens. I need someone who can handle all of it. I can. I need someone here by 7 o'clock in the morning. I can be here. You have a young child. Young children get sick." Delia looked directly into the woman's eyes. "I have someone to care for my daughter. I haven't missed a single day of work in 3 years. Renata Cardoni smiled. It was the smile all of Providence knew. The smile that made people believe they had just been chosen from the crowd. "There is one more thing. There is a machine in the laundry room, but I don't use it. All of my clothes are washed by hand. Can you do that?" For 1 second, Delia Novak thought of the $41,000 sitting in the hands of the collection agency. She thought of the heart valve the doctors said would have to be replaced when her daughter was 7 or 8. She thought of the partially open basement door and the left hand rising into the light. "I can," she said. "Good." Renata folded the file closed. "You begin Monday." Delia rose, thanked her, and followed the employment agent toward the door. She crossed the main hall, past the foot of the staircase, and walked by the door leading down to the basement, where she caught a glimpse of a combination lock. She memorized its location. Once she reached the street, she walked half a block before allowing herself to breathe out. She had made it inside. In the eastern sitting room, Renata Cardoni remained seated alone, her left hand resting on the arm of the chair, one finger tapping softly 3 times against the fabric. 8 months. For those 8 months, the only person in the world capable of speaking a sentence that could bring down everything Renata had built would be living inside her house, walking beneath her eyes, and eating a lunch paid for with her money. Renata would know what time the woman woke, what time she left, and whom she spoke to. She would never have to spend another dollar on surveillance. The 2 women left that room on the same morning and walked in opposite directions, and each of them believed she had just won. During those 8 months, Delia Novak memorized that house the way someone memorized a prayer. She knew the 9th step from the bottom creaked. She knew the office door was always pulled shut but never locked, though the bottom desk drawer had its own lock and the key stayed in the pocket of the man who lived in the house. She knew the combination on the basement door was changed on the first day of every month. She knew the 3 cameras in the yard swept in wide arcs, and that there was a blind spot lasting 2.5 seconds in the southeast corner, where none of them could see. She kept all of it in her head and didn't write a single word on paper, because she had already learned that lesson. She was introduced to guests with the same 3 words: Mrs. Ferraro would gesture toward Delia as she stood holding a tray and tell some visitor that she was a distant relative, staying with them and helping around the house. The guest would nod, smile, and never ask her name. The first time Delia heard it, she nearly dropped the tray. By the 10th time, she simply lowered her head in greeting and kept walking. Some humiliations, when repeated often enough, stopped cutting into the skin. They hardened into a thick layer beneath the soles of the feet, and a person learned to keep walking on them. At night, after everyone in the house had gone to sleep, she did her 4th job. She opened the filing cabinet in the office, read every folder, and returned each one exactly as she had found it. She went through every ledger on the shelves. She opened the cardboard boxes in the storage room, ran her fingers along the spines of every photo album, and checked behind the paintings on the walls for hidden safes. She did this on 94 nights over 8 months, for about 40 minutes each night, and she found nothing. Not one scrap of paper, not one name, not one number. That woman kept nothing inside the house. Some nights, Delia sat down on the storage room floor among the opened boxes, wrapped both arms around her knees, and wondered whether she had been wrong from the beginning, Whether the figure behind the crack in the door had been someone else, whether for 3 years she had been chasing a shadow she had created herself, because she couldn't bear the thought that everything had been taken from her for no reason at all. Then she stood, put every box back in place, and returned at 7 o'clock the following morning. During the 6th month, she was nearly caught. She was standing in front of the filing cabinet at 2 o'clock in the morning when she heard the 9th stair creak. She turned off the light, pressed herself behind the door, and listened as the man of the house came downstairs to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, poured himself a glass of water, and went back up. 37 seconds. She had counted. After that night, she waited in the hallway for another 10 minutes before entering each time, simply to listen. During the 7th month, she began thinking about giving up. Her daughter was nearly 7. The hospital had sent a letter reminding her about the next examination. The money she had earned during 7 months in that house, combined with what she made cleaning rented homes in the afternoons, had allowed her to pay another $6,000 to the collection agency, and she had calculated that if she continued at this rate, her account would be clear in 2 years. 2 years. She had begun telling herself that perhaps this was what she was supposed to do, that perhaps she should stop searching through the house at night and simply work, collect her wages, pay the debt, and take her daughter in for surgery. Then came a Friday afternoon near the end of the 7th month. It was hot that day, and Renata Cardoni was sitting at the long table in the dining room, finishing some paperwork. In front of her lay a stack of bills, a checkbook, and a fountain pen. Delia was called in to receive her monthly wages. She stood beside the table with her hands folded in front of her and waited. "Stand there," Renata said without looking up. "Let me finish this first." She wrote 3 checks. Delia stood watching, and as she watched, one very small detail caught her attention. The woman held the pen in her left hand. Delia had been inside that house for 7 months. She had seen Renata hold a glass, hold a telephone, carry a handbag, open doors, and point at things. But writing was different. A person could hold a glass in either hand. Writing belonged to only one. Renata Cardoni placed the 3rd check on the table, held it steady with the 4 fingers of her right hand, and signed her name with her left. A long signature with a broad, looping stroke at the end. Her wrist curved slightly in the distinctive way a left-handed person's wrist bent while writing across a tabletop. The afternoon sunlight came through the western window at an angle and fell across that hand, and on the ring finger, the 2 rings fitted together caught the light, flashed once, then disappeared when she lifted her hand. Delia Novak went completely still. Inside her mind, the pharmacy storage room door opened again by a gap about the width of a hand. The storage room light spilled through it. A figure stood perfectly still, a full head shorter than Wesley Crane. A hand rose, the left hand, the fingers slightly curled inward, and something on the ring finger flashed once before going dark. For 5 years, she had replayed that moment in her mind more times than she could count. She had described it to the officer taking her statement at the police station. She had asked herself whether she had remembered it incorrectly, whether she had imagined it. Now it was standing directly in front of her, 1 meter away, beneath the afternoon sunlight, and it matched. It matched completely. "Miss Novak." Delia flinched. "Yes." Renata tore the check from the book, blew gently across it to dry the ink, then held it out. She raised her eyes to Delia, and for 2 seconds, the 2 women looked directly at one another. "What is wrong with you? Your face has gone completely pale. I feel a little dizzy. It is very hot today. Then go drink some water." Renata Cardoni placed the check on the edge of the table and smiled, the smile the entire city knew. "Go and drink some water. I need you healthy. We have guests coming next week." Delia picked up the check, thanked her, and left the dining room with steady steps. She crossed the hall, passed the foot of the staircase, entered the laundry room, closed the door, and leaned back against it. The check was still in her hand, and as she stood there, a second thought came to her, about half a minute after the first, but far colder. For 7 months, she had wondered why she had been hired to work in that house. She had believed it was good fortune. She had believed they needed someone, and she had arrived at the right moment. Now, standing inside a laundry room containing an expensive washing machine no one was allowed to use, Delia Novak understood that the woman outside knew exactly who she was, had known from the very first day, and had opened the door for her not because she needed a housekeeper. Delia wasn't the hunter waiting inside the brush. For the past 7 months, she had been the thing locked inside the cage. Rocco Vitale had walked about 200 meters along the road, leading away from the prison, when he heard tires slowing behind him. A black car pulled toward the shoulder, moved a few steps ahead of him, then came to a complete stop. The door opened. The man who stepped out appeared to be around 40, wore a navy blue suit, and carried a thin document case in one hand. He hurried around the front of the car with the look of someone who had been waiting there for quite some time. "Mr. Vitale." Rocco stopped. He looked the man over from head to toe and didn't recognize him. During his 20 years in Providence, he had sat at the same table with nearly every lawyer of consequence in that city, and this face had never appeared at any of those tables. "Who are you?" The man took a business card from his breast pocket and offered it with both hands. "I handle certain legal matters for the family. Mrs. Ferraro sent me to collect you." Rocco took the card. He didn't look at the name printed on it. He looked at the 3 words the man had just spoken, words that seemed to hang in the air between them, and he stood there for so long that the lawyer had to clear his throat. "The car is waiting, sir. We will go directly to Manchester Airport. The ticket has already been booked. There is a flight to Miami this afternoon, and she has arranged a place for you to stay there for several weeks before." "What did you just call her?" The lawyer paused. "Excuse me? What name did you just use for her?" For 2 seconds, the man's eyes blinked faster than usual. He had been given very careful instructions about many things, but whoever had instructed him had forgotten one detail, or had decided that detail mattered less than getting this man onto an airplane before nightfall. "Mrs. Ferraro," he said. "That is the name used on the legal documents, sir. I am only following the records." Rocco Vitale nodded slowly. With one hand, he folded the business card in half and slipped it into his trouser pocket. "Thank you for coming all this way. Then please get into the car. I am walking. Sir, the city is 300 kilometers away. Then I will walk to the bus station." He stepped past the lawyer and continued in the opposite direction from the car. Behind him, the man called out twice more. Then came the sound of the car door closing, followed by the engine starting, and the black car turned around and drove back toward the prison gate. Rocco didn't look back. There were 3 things in his trouser pocket: an old leather wallet containing $42 in cash, and a prison release card, a business card folded in half, and a steel watch whose crystal was scratched into faint cloudy circles, the watch that had remained sealed inside a property box for 5 years and had been returned to him that morning, along with a form he had been required to sign. He didn't put it on his wrist. He only kept it in his pocket, and throughout the 7-hour bus ride back to Providence, his hand would occasionally slip inside and close around it. He reached the city at nearly 7 o'clock that evening. He called no one. He walked from the bus station up toward Federal Hill, passed along Atwell Street, and went by the bakery where he had spent 10 years sitting in the room behind the shop. The bakery was still there, but the sign had changed color, and the young woman behind the counter was someone he didn't know. The city had continued living for 5 years without asking his permission. He reached the beginning of his street just as darkness settled completely. Then he stopped. The house he had built when he was 28 had once had an old iron gate that required him to get out of the car and open it by hand. Now there was a black electric gate, about half a meter taller than the old one, with 4 cameras mounted along the wall and another aimed down at the entrance. The fence had been rebuilt in stone. There was a fountain in the yard that he had never seen before, and on the pillar to the right of the gate, where there had once been only a brass house number, there was now a larger brass plaque, polished and engraved with 5 letters: Ferraro. Rocco Vitale stood across the street beneath the shadow of a maple tree and stared at that plaque. He remained there for about 10 minutes. Then the front door opened. Light spilled from the house onto the steps. A woman came out first, carrying a coat, and even from that distance, even in the darkness, he recognized the way she walked. A man followed her outside, closed the door, and reached for the coat in her hands so that he could place it around her shoulders. Then he bent down. It wasn't the kiss of 2 people who had only recently met. It was the kiss of 2 people who had done it thousands of times, familiar and unhurried, and the woman raised her hand to straighten the man's collar with the exact gesture she had once used on Rocco in his own kitchen on mornings many years before. Rocco Vitale didn't move. He didn't feel heat rise into his face. He didn't feel his heart begin to race. He only felt something inside him slowly sinking, like water draining from a reservoir. And when it had emptied completely, there was nothing left inside but space. The 2 of them got into the car. The electric gate opened, then closed again. The taillights disappeared at the end of the street. He remained where he was, About 10 minutes later, the side door of the house opened. A woman stepped out wearing a gray uniform and began pulling 2 large trash bins from the yard toward the curb. She was thin. She dragged the first one out, set it in place, then went back for the second, and while pulling the second one, she had to stop halfway to change hands. The streetlight fell across her. Rocco Vitale saw that face and straightened away from the tree. He had seen it 3 times in his life. Once from below, when he lay on the table in room number 2 and she stitched him without asking a single question. Once across the nurse's station, when she pushed the envelope back toward him with 2 fingers. And once in the brightly lit basement corridor, when he knelt in front of her and told her that she hadn't been there that night. The woman pushed the second trash bin against the curb, released a breath, and wiped her forehead with her sleeve. Then she turned back toward the yard, and the side door closed behind her. Delia Novak left the house at 9:40 that evening. She followed her familiar route, walking down the slope of Federal Hill and turning left at the corner where the streetlight had been broken for 3 months without anyone repairing it. She had gone half a block when someone stepped out of the darkness ahead of her, about 5 paces away, and stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. Delia froze. Her hand immediately slipped into her coat pocket and closed around her keys. Miss Novak. She recognized the voice before she recognized the face. A quiet voice, so quiet that a person had to tilt their head to hear it. During the past 5 years, she had heard it again in her mind more times than she could count. Delia stepped backward. Go away. I only want to talk. I have nothing to say to you. How long have you been working in that house? She took another step back, and this time her shoulders touched the brick wall behind her. She stood there with her hand still gripping the keys inside her pocket, and when she opened her mouth, her voice didn't tremble. It came out strangely even, with the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed these words in her mind for years, without ever having anyone to say them to. Do you know what you asked of me that night? You told me that I hadn't been there. I did exactly what you said. I went home, sat on the floor, watched my daughter sleep until morning, and stayed silent. I stayed silent for 3 months. Rocco remained still. 3 months, Mr. Vitale. Then I couldn't bear it anymore. I was a nurse. I had taken an oath. A man had died inside that storage room, and the man in prison wasn't the person who had been standing inside it. And every day I walked past that corridor, I kept wondering whose hands those drugs would reach tomorrow. She continued, and only then did her voice begin to break. So in the 3rd month, I walked to the Providence Police Department. I sat there for 4 hours. I told them everything. They typed it into 3 pages, and I signed my name at the bottom of the 3rd page. 3 weeks later, they opened my locker at the hospital and found 17 ampules of medication inside. 9 days after that, the board permanently revoked my nursing license. My name was placed on the statewide list, barring me from working anywhere in healthcare. 11 years of education were gone. The head nurse who defended me was reassigned to cleaning floors on the night shift, and she is still cleaning them to this day. Delia drew a breath. I have spent 4 years and 7 months paying for those 3 months of silence. So what else do you want to ask of me? Rocco Vitale stood in the middle of the sidewalk, unable to speak. Inside his mind, something was slowly being turned upside down. He had spent 5 years believing that this woman had gone home, that she had been safe, that she had continued living, and that protecting her had been the one thing he had done right in all of it. The condition he had placed before the men around that round table, the only condition he had demanded in exchange for 5 years of his life, had protected nothing but her pulse. No one had touched her. They had merely taken everything else. I didn't know, he said. Of course you didn't. You said you gave a statement. What did you tell them? What I saw. What did you see? Delia raised her eyes to his, and she finally spoke the truth that no one had been willing to hear for 5 years. I arrived 10 minutes early. The storage room door was partly open. I heard 2 people arguing inside, Mr. Crane and a woman. Rocco straightened. I looked through the opening. I saw Mr. Crane's back, and behind him, about 2 meters away, there was another person, a full head shorter than he was, standing perfectly still. She continued slowly. Mr. Crane had his back to that person. He never raised his hands. He didn't rush at anyone. He was speaking, and the other person was standing behind him listening. Rocco Vitale heard every word. Then I heard a sound behind me. Every light in the hallway went out. I fell against the filing cabinet, and I don't remember anything after that until you arrived. Delia looked directly into his eyes. I never saw Mr. Crane attack anyone. Not once. And there were only 2 people inside that storage room that night, Mr. Vitale, until a third person turned off the lights behind me. Rocco remained silent for a very long time. Then he asked in the hoarse voice of a man who had just lost something enormous, "Do you remember the date you signed that statement?" "I remember. Do you have a copy?" "No, they didn't give me one." She released the keys inside her pocket and began walking away. "I have to go home. My daughter is waiting." Rocco followed her. He stayed about 3 paces behind and said nothing. And she didn't tell him to leave again. They walked for 20 minutes down Cranston Street, past a closed automobile repair shop, past a gas station, and stopped in front of a laundromat that was still lit, with 2 dryers turning inside. Delia went around to the side entrance and opened the wooden door at the back. The moment it opened, a little girl came rushing toward her. "Mommy!" Then the child stopped short and looked up at the man standing behind her mother. She looked at him from below, tilted her head to the left, then to the right. "You're taller than the refrigerator." Rocco Vitale looked down at the little girl standing directly in front of him. "Am I?" "A whole lot taller." She turned and pointed toward the refrigerator against the wall. "Mommy says the refrigerator is the tallest thing in the house." Delia placed a hand on her daughter's head. "Go inside, sweetheart. He came to speak with me." The little girl ran in, then poked her head back through the doorway. "Mister, can you count to 30? Junie, I was only asking." The child giggled and disappeared inside. Rocco stood at the threshold. He didn't step into the room. From where he stood, he could see all of it in a single glance. A small string of lights stretched across the ceiling, a wall covered with crayon drawings arranged in neat rows from low to high, a blanket folded into a precise square at the foot of the bed, and on the refrigerator door, secured with 4 pieces of paper tape, there was a printed document. He looked at it. The name St. Aldegand Hospital appeared on the first line. In the middle was a short paragraph about the status of an account, and in the lower right corner, a number had been circled in red ink, traced over again and again, until the paper beneath it had begun to tear. 41,000. Rocco Vitale stared at that number for a very long time. Then he turned away from the doorway, walked outside, and sat down on the concrete step. He remained there with both hands resting on his knees, his back slightly bent, his eyes fixed on the darkness across the street. From inside came the sound of running water, dishes touching, and a child telling a very long and very important story. Rocco Vitale sat on that step for nearly an hour without saying a single word. The elder care facility in Woonsocket stood at the end of a road lined with 2 rows of maple trees, and its visitor room carried the same smell as every visitor room in every facility of its kind across the country. They told Rocco to wait. 15 minutes later, a nurse pushed out a wheelchair, and seated in it was a 79-year-old man, with both hands resting on his lap. His eyes turned toward the window, rather than toward anyone in the room. "Mr. Sabatini, you have a visitor," the nurse said loudly. Then she turned to Rocco and lowered her voice. "He is a little tired today. Some days he can talk for hours, and some days he doesn't recognize anyone. Just speak to him normally. Don't force him to remember." She left. Rocco pulled a chair closer. "Uncle Otto." The old man didn't turn. "Uncle Otto, it is me." Otto Sabatini kept looking out the window, where a bird was perched on the fence. He murmured something very softly about rain coming. Rocco sat there for 10 minutes, then 20. He asked about Otto's health, asked about the food, asked whether his daughter visited often. The old man answered a few questions, but every answer drifted slightly away from what had been asked, as though he were speaking to someone else in another year. At the 25th minute, Rocco Vitale leaned back in his chair and sighed. He reached into his coat pocket, took out the steel watch, and placed it on the table between them. Then he spoke, not quite to anyone at all. "I wonder what my father would say if he were still alive." "I don't know anymore." The old man turned his head. "Gaetano," he said. Rocco sat upright. "Yes, my father." Otto Sabatini looked down at the watch on the table, and something in his eyes changed, as though someone had thrown a switch somewhere very deep inside him. He reached out, touched the scratched crystal, then took hold of Rocco's wrist. "You are out." "I am out." "How long?" 5 years, uncle." The old man nodded slowly. Then he spoke, and his voice no longer wandered at all. Every word came clearly, like a man waking from a very long sleep. "Sit down. I have been waiting 5 years to tell you something." Rocco sat. "You told me to find the person who was opening the door and letting that poison into our family. I found him." Otto drew a breath. "It took me 7 months. I followed the route backward, from the place where the product was received to the place where it came from. It wasn't coming through the docks. It wasn't coming through the streets. It was coming out of the hospital. You found the person inside the hospital. I found Wesley Crane, head of the pharmacy department." The old man looked directly into his eyes, but he wasn't the one in charge. He was only the hand signing the papers. Someone told him what to sign, and that person didn't work at the hospital. "Did you have a name?" "Not then, so I did what your father always taught us. I didn't search for the name. I searched for the person who would say the name." Otto tapped one finger against the table. "I went to see Crane 3 times. On the 3rd visit, he agreed. He was afraid, Rocco. He was so afraid that I had to promise him someone would protect him after he spoke. I arranged for him to bring out the ledger, the real one, with the names, dates, and account numbers. I told him to meet me in the basement pharmacy storage room at 11 o'clock at night on March 4th. Rocco Vitali didn't move. March 4th. You arranged the meeting. I arranged it. You didn't tell me. I planned to tell you once I had the papers in my hands. I didn't want to give you a name before I had proof I could hold." The old man closed his eyes. "That evening, I sat at home waiting for the telephone to ring. No one called. The next morning, I opened the newspaper and saw your name. In that visitor room with its smell of antiseptic, Rocco Vitali sat motionless and allowed what he had just heard to settle into its proper place. The man who had lain beside the base of the shelf in that storage room hadn't been a blackmailer. He had been Rocco's own witness. He had agreed to speak, had carried the ledger to a meeting arranged by one of Rocco's men, and had died before he could reveal the name Rocco had spent 7 months trying to find. And Rocco Vitali had entered that basement 40 minutes later, seen all 3 signs, invented 3 explanations for them, and confessed. He had used 5 years of his life to close the lid on the coffin of his own witness, and the person he had protected throughout those 5 years was the very person who had silenced that witness. "Tell me," Rocco said, his voice so quiet that the old man had to lean closer. "Do you know who went to meet Crane that night?" Otto Sabatini opened his eyes. "I know who drove that person there." Rocco waited. 7 days after your arrest, I opposed expanding the distribution operation, right there at the table. Then I knew they would come for me. I had 2 days before they arrived to take me away. I used those 2 days to ask one question." The old man tightened his grip around Rocco's wrist. "I asked the parking attendant at the restaurant on Broadway Street. On the night of March 4th, one of our black cars left the lot at 10:35 and returned at 11:50. Nicola Ferraro was behind the wheel. Rocco didn't move. He drove that person to the hospital. He waited outside in the car. Then he drove that person home." "Are you certain?" "The parking attendant kept a ledger, Rocco. He had recorded every night for 30 years. I saw the record." Rocco Vitali remained seated for a long time. Then he asked the final question, the one that had been inside his mind since the previous night, since he had sat on the concrete step outside a laundromat. "Uncle Otto, there was a nurse struck unconscious in the hallway that night. She was lying 15 steps from the storage room door. Why did they let her live?" The old man was silent for a long while. Then he spoke, and his voice slowed, with the slowness of someone who had lived long enough to understand that the worst things were often born not from cruelty, but from calculation. "You are asking the wrong question. Then what is the right one? The right question is who benefited from keeping her alive." Otto Sabatini released Rocco's wrist, leaned back in his wheelchair, and looked toward the window. Nico didn't kill her because he needed her. The woman inside that storage room had just done something she would never be able to wash away. And there was only one person in the world who had seen it. If that person died, the matter would end there, and the woman would be free. But if that person remained alive, still walking the streets, still remembering, then for the rest of her life, that woman would have to obey one man and one man alone. The old man turned his head and looked at Rocco. "Do you understand now? He didn't spare that nurse. He put her away. She was the rope he tied around his wife's neck, and he has been pulling that rope for 5 years. Dale Kowalczyk had been retired for 2 years, and he lived in a small house in the Silver Lake neighborhood, where he spent most of his time repairing a fishing boat he had never once put in the water. When Rocco Vitali knocked on his door one Thursday afternoon, Kowalczyk opened it, looked at the man standing on the porch, and didn't seem surprised at all. "I've been expecting you since the day you got out," he said. "You knew I was out. This whole city knew you were out." He stepped aside. "Come in. I'll make coffee." They sat at a kitchen table with one leg propped up by a piece of cardboard. Kowalczyk poured the coffee, sat down, and spoke before Rocco could begin. "I closed your case after 11 days. My superior told me to close it, so I closed it. But before I did, I wrote 2 lines by hand at the bottom of the final page and signed my name. I wrote that the suspect's statement failed to explain 3 points, and I wrote that I objected to ending the investigation." He took a sip. "Those 2 lines have been sitting there for 8 years. No one has read them. Can you still get into the file? I'm retired. I'm not dead. There are still a few people in that department who owe me." 3 days later, Kowalczyk called. He wouldn't speak over the telephone. He arranged to meet at a diner on Route 6, and when Rocco arrived, the old inspector was already seated at the last table with a brown file folder in front of him. "Sit down first." He pushed the folder across the table. "It took me 3 days to find this, and I didn't find it in the case file. It was in an auxiliary archive, among the unprocessed records, filed under the label Unreliable Witness." Rocco opened the folder. Inside were 3 typewritten pages, their edges slightly yellowed with age. The first page listed the date, the starting time, and the ending time. 4 hours and 10 minutes. He began reading from the top. He read the passage about the telephone call at 10 o'clock that night, the passage about the meeting arranged for 11, the passage about the door standing open by the width of a hand, the passage describing a figure a full head shorter than Wesley Crane, standing perfectly still, and the left hand rising with something flashing on the ring finger, the passage about the sound of a shoe sole behind her, and the entire row of hallway lights suddenly going dark. He reached the 3rd page, and at the bottom was a handwritten sentence the officer had added at the witness's request. "I know what I will lose by signing this. I am signing it anyway." Beneath it was the signature. Delia Novak. The date had been written by hand, the pen stroke trembling slightly on the final digit. Rocco Vitali read that sentence. Then he read it again. Then he placed the pages on the table, straightened his back, and looked through the diner's window. The retired inspector sitting across from him said nothing. He had sat in many rooms with many men, and he knew when silence was necessary. 3 minutes passed. Rocco still didn't speak. "Who stamped this?" he finally asked. Kowalczyk turned over the final page and pointed to a square containing a hurried signature. "The desk officer on duty that day. He retired 3 years later, 4 years before he was eligible. I have an old friend in financial investigations. He said that during this man's final 2 years before retirement, 3 cash deposits were made into his account, each one for $9,800. Rocco nodded. 9,800. The mandatory reporting threshold was 10,000. "Now listen to me," Kowalczyk said. "This proves she gave a statement. It proves someone buried that statement, but it doesn't prove who was inside the storage room. A statement is still only a statement. To overturn a case in which someone has already confessed, you need something no one can dispute." That evening, Rocco handed the 3 pages to Delia Novak on the concrete step outside the laundromat. She saw her own signature for the first time in 8 years, then sat down on the step with the pages on her lap, both hands trembling. "They did read it," she said. "They read it, and then they put it away under that label." "We are still missing one thing," Rocco said. "We need something that proves who was there, what time they entered, and what time they left." The hospital cameras recorded nothing that night. The security company said the parking lot footage had passed its retention period long ago. Delia didn't answer immediately. She remained still, looking down at the pages on her lap. Then her head came up sharply. The parking lot camera wasn't the only camera in that area. Rocco turned toward her. "The hospital has 3 kinds of waste," she said, and her voice began to quicken. "Ordinary waste, recycling, and medical waste. Medical waste has to be handled separately under federal regulations, and the hospital doesn't do it itself. They hire an outside contractor. The loading dock in the northeast corner belongs to the contractor, not the hospital. Their trucks come and go at night, and they have to prove where every shipment went, who signed for it, and at what time." Rocco stood. "The cameras at that loading dock belong to them, their servers, and the law requires them to keep the recordings for 7 years. Delia rose with him. It happened 5 years ago, Mr. Vitale. There are still 2 years before the retention period ends. What is that loading dock face? Directly toward the rear entrance. After 9 o'clock at night, that rear entrance is the only way down to the basement. By 2 o'clock the following morning, they had discovered that the company was still operating, with its headquarters in Warwick. At 4 o'clock, the manager of the data archive, a man in his 50s who had just been awakened, sat before a monitor in a freezing room and typed the date into the search field. He said no one had ever requested any footage from that year, not once, and he asked 3 separate times whether they were certain the date was March 4th. They were. A grainy black and white image appeared on the screen. A sequence of numbers ran in the upper left corner. The loading dock occupied the right side of the frame, and on the left was a stretch of concrete yard containing the rear entrance to the main building. The manager fast-forwarded. Then he stopped. 10:37 in the evening. A black car entered the frame, parked about 10 meters from the rear entrance, and turned off its lights. 10:41. The door on the right side of the car opened. A woman stepped out. Her shadow crossed the yard as she walked to the rear entrance, opened the door, and went inside. The door closed behind her. The driver remained inside the car. 3 minutes later, he got out, leaned against the door, and stayed there. Rocco Vitale stared at the face on the screen. The face of a 36-year-old man waiting in the parking lot, occasionally checking his watch and, once, raising a hand to smooth his tie slowly from the knot down to his stomach. 11:06. The rear door opened. The woman came out, walking faster than she had when she entered, and got into the car. The man closed the car door for her. The vehicle drove out of the frame. For a long while, no one in that freezing room spoke. Then Kowalczyk took out a pen and wrote exactly 2 numbers in his notebook. 25 minutes, he said. She told me she went down to the basement after everything had already happened. She said she walked in and found the man already lying there. He closed the notebook. These are 25 minutes that neither of them accounted for in their statements. And you didn't receive her call until 11 minutes after she walked out of that door. Rocco Vitale requested a meeting with the Round Table on Saturday evening, and they granted him one on Tuesday night, 3 days later, in the room behind the restaurant on Broadway Street. 11 men sat around that oak table, just as they had 5 years earlier, except that 3 faces had changed, and his chair no longer belonged to him. Nico Ferraro sat in the seat to Don Silvio's right. Renata Cardoni had been invited as Nico's wife, and she sat at the far end of the table, with both hands resting on her lap, dressed in pale gray and wearing no jewelry except the 2 rings fitted together on the ring finger of her left hand. Rocco remained standing. He didn't sit, even after someone pulled out a chair for him. He placed a document case on the table, opened it, and presented each layer of evidence one at a time. Slowly, in the quiet voice that forced everyone in the room to remain silent in order to hear him. The first layer was the 3-page statement signed by a nurse named Delia Novak, recording the date and time and stating that on the night of March 4th, there had been a woman standing behind Wesley Crane inside the pharmacy storage room, and that Crane hadn't attacked anyone. Renata Cardoni gave a soft laugh. A woman dismissed for stealing medication can say anything she wants. The second layer was the stamp on the back of the final page, the name of the officer who had filed the statement under unreliable witness, and the 3 cash deposits of $9,800 made into his account during the following 2 years. People accept money for every reason in the world, Renata said. What does his business have to do with me? The third layer was Ottavio Sabatini's account, stating that he had arranged the meeting that night, that Wesley Crane had been a witness for the Vitale family, and that Crane had been bringing the ledger to reveal the name of the person controlling the distribution operation, running beneath the family's name. At the third layer, 2 men in the room shifted in their chairs. The old man has lost his mind, Renata said, her voice still as sweet as it had been at the beginning. A doctor signed the papers 5 years ago. Are we really going to listen to a man who can't even remember what day it is? For the 4th layer, Rocco placed a tablet on the table, turned it on, and played the black and white recording from the medical waste loading dock at St. Aldegond Hospital. No one spoke for 4 minutes. They watched the numbers moving in the upper left corner. They watched the black car enter the frame at 10:37. They watched a woman step out at 10:41 and walk through the rear entrance. They watched the driver leave the vehicle, lean against the door, and raise one hand to smooth his tie from the knot down to his stomach. They watched the rear door open at 11:06 and the woman come out, walking faster than she had when she entered. Rocco turned off the screen. 25 minutes, he said. She told the police she arrived after everything had already happened. This recording shows that she was inside for 25 minutes, alone with that man. And I didn't receive her call until 11 minutes after she came through that door. He looked around the table. I served 5 years for that night. I served time for something I didn't do, protecting someone I believed was terrified. What I was truly protecting, gentlemen, was the distribution operation my father banned from this family 30 years ago. No one in the room spoke. Renata Cardoni sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, and for the first time that evening, she wasn't smiling. Rocco turned toward Don Silvio Aiello. I am asking for nothing for myself. I am asking this family to place the right name on the right deed. Don Silvio Aiello sat at the head of the table with both hands resting on the cane, standing between his knees, and he had remained silent that way from the beginning. Now he raised his head. He looked at Rocco. Then he looked down at the oak table and struck the tip of his cane against the floor once. Have you finished? Yes. Then sit down and listen to me. Rocco didn't sit. The old man didn't force him. You are Gaetano's son. I ate at your family's table before you could walk, so I will speak to you the way people speak to family, which means I will tell you the truth. His eyes traveled once around the table, and that gaze stopped briefly on 3 men, so quickly that it might have gone unnoticed, but not quickly enough for Rocco to miss it. For 3 years, that operation has supported more than half the people sitting in this room. It pays for their children's education. It pays for their wives' medicine. You have opened a box and ordered everyone at this table to look inside, and you think anyone here wants to look? Then you are telling me you don't believe the recording. I am not saying I don't believe it. Don Silvio placed both hands on top of his cane. I am saying this matter was closed 5 years ago. You confessed. You went away. You came back. Now you return and open it again. But you aren't reopening one night. You are reopening 3 years of records, belonging to 11 families. Do you understand what I am saying? I understand. Good. The old man struck his cane against the floor a second time. Then this is my decision. The matter of March 4th is closed. Whoever confessed has already confessed. From this day forward, Rocco Vitali has no voice at this table. Someone pushed a chair back very softly. No one objected. And you will leave Providence within 48 hours. Rocco Vitali stood there with both hands resting on the table, and for 4 seconds, he felt nothing at all. Then the old man added one more thing, speaking in the voice of someone clearing away the final pieces of an evening's unfinished business. And it was this sentence that sent cold through Rocco's spine. There is one more matter. 5 years ago you sat in that chair and asked this table for one thing. You asked that no one touch that nurse. I agreed. Don Silvio Aiello looked at him. But that promise was made to a man who had a seat at this table. You no longer have a seat here. From this moment forward, the promise is no longer in force. At that moment, Rocco Vitali heard very clearly the sound of a chair at the end of the table sliding backward by several inches. He didn't need to turn around to know whose chair it was. He looked directly at the old man and spoke as quietly as always. You have just opened a door to something you won't be able to stop. You have 48 hours. Rocco closed the document case, picked it up, and walked out. He passed Nico Ferraro, who didn't raise his eyes to look at him. He passed the far end of the table, where Renata Cardoni sat with both hands on her lap, and as he moved beside her, she looked up. She didn't smile. She only watched him, and there was no fear in her eyes, no triumph, only a swift and chilling calculation, the look of someone who had just been handed back an object that had been taken away from her long ago. Rocco Vitali stepped into the street, stood beneath the lights of Broadway Street, and looked at the watch on his wrist. It was 9:12 in the evening. He had 48 hours to leave the city, but those 48 hours didn't belong to him. At 7 o'clock the following morning, a woman would enter the Federal Hill House through the side door and begin working as she did every day, never knowing that tonight, in the room behind a restaurant on Broadway Street, the only shield that had protected her for 5 years had just been taken away. He pulled out his phone and began to run. Delia Novak listened to everything Rocco said over the telephone at 9:18 that night, and when he finished, she remained silent for exactly 3 seconds before telling him that she wouldn't run. He told her she had to. She said she had been running for 5 years already, running from 3 jobs to 3 more, running from one room to another, and running had never taken her anywhere. She said she still had the kitchen door key, that at 7 o'clock the next morning she would still be allowed to enter that house as she did every day, and that she had exactly one night before anyone thought to take that key away from her. Rocco was silent for a long time on the other end of the line. Then he said he would wait at the corner with the broken streetlight, and if she didn't come out within 40 minutes, he would go inside. At 1:16 in the morning, Delia unlocked the kitchen door with her own key and entered the dark house. She didn't turn on the lights. She followed the path she had walked for 8 months, avoided the 9th stair, and went directly to the woman's dressing room, a room she had vacuumed hundreds of times and had never once searched. The safe was hidden behind the large mirror, and she had known it was there since the 3rd month, known without being able to do anything because she didn't have the combination. But there was one thing she knew even better than the safe. During 8 months of working in that house, she had watched the woman enter the code for the front gate, the basement door, and the alarm system. And all 3 times, she had used the same sequence of numbers. Some people were careful with everything except their own habits. Delia raised her hand to the keypad and entered 6 numbers. The safe door opened. There was no money inside, no gold, no property documents. There was a flat cardboard box, and inside that box was a stack of envelopes held together with a rubber band. Delia took them out and counted them by the light of her telephone. 43. Each one bore her own handwriting. They were the 43 letters she had sent to the federal prison in New Hampshire during the first 2 years after losing her license. Letters she had written at night, after her dishwashing shifts, never asking for money, never describing her suffering, asking for only one thing: that the man inside sign a statement confirming that she had been present in the basement on March 4th, so she would have something to submit to the licensing board. Not one of them had reached him. 42 remained sealed, their folds and glued edges untouched. The 43rd had been opened. Delia pulled it out and unfolded it. Inside wasn't one of her letters. Inside were 3 typewritten pages with yellowed edges, a stamp on the back of the final page, and at the bottom of the 3rd page, a handwritten sentence and a signature she had last seen 3 days earlier in a diner on Route 6, a copy of her own statement. It meant that woman had held it in her hand since the 3rd month of the 1st year. It meant that throughout the 8 months Delia had searched the house at night, the thing she was looking for had been sitting inside the safe, 3 meters from where she vacuumed. And it meant the woman had kept it, rather than destroying it for 8 full years. Delia stood in the darkness and understood why. It wasn't a keepsake. It was the only surviving evidence in the world proving that someone had seen what happened inside that storage room. And if Nico Ferraro learned that the statement still existed, he would know that the rope he had tied around his wife's neck for 5 years wasn't being held by him at all. She was holding it herself. That woman had preserved the very thing capable of destroying her, simply to keep it from ever falling into her husband's hands. At 4:15 that morning, Rocco Vitali stood outside an apartment in Elmhurst and knocked on the door. Nico Ferraro opened it with his shirt still only partly buttoned. Rocco didn't say a word. He held out the opened envelope. Nico took it, opened it, read the first page, then turned to the 3rd and stared at the signature at the bottom. He stood there for about 10 seconds. Then he raised one hand to smooth his tie, the gesture he had made thousands of times, from the knot down to his stomach. But that night, he wasn't wearing a tie. His hand stopped halfway down over the wrinkled shirt and remained there. At 9 o'clock the following morning, Nicola Ferraro sat before a federal prosecutor in the federal building on Kennedy Avenue, accompanied by his own attorney, and began to talk. He didn't confess because he felt remorse. He confessed because he had calculated very quickly that once this box was opened, he would be the first person pushed forward, and the only person who still had time to bargain was the one who arrived first. The case exploded over the next 41 days. 3 years of records from the distribution operation were opened 1 page at a time. 19 people were arrested in Providence, and 7 in Fall River. The round table in the room behind the restaurant on Broadway Street collapsed in a single afternoon. Don Silvio Aiello was led from his home at 6 o'clock in the morning, leaning on his cane, and the officers had to bring the cane with them in the vehicle. Renata Cardoni was charged with murder and a series of other crimes. The recording from the St. Aldegun Hospital medical waste loading dock was admitted in court with a complete chain of custody. The 3-page statement signed by Delia Novak, which had spent 8 years beneath the label unreliable witness, was presented to the jury and read aloud. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. 3 weeks after everything settled, 3 men came to find Rocco Vitale at a cafe on Atwell Street. They told him the chair was empty now, that the Vitale name still carried its full value, and that the city needed someone who knew how to keep order. Rocco listened to everything they said. Then he reached into his coat pocket, took out the steel watch with the scratched crystal, placed it on the table, and said that his father had left him exactly one thing, and that thing was a name, and he intended to return it intact. The three men stood, nodded, and never came back. Delia Novak's disciplinary record was reviewed and completely erased. The Rhode Island State Licensing Board restored her nursing license with retroactive effect and issued a formal apology, exactly 1 page long. Her name was removed from the employment ban list. Harriet Cobb was returned to her position as night shift head nurse after 8 years of cleaning the hallways in Section C. And on the day she received the decision, the entire emergency department applauded so loudly that she had to turn away and wipe her glasses. The $41,000 debt was erased as part of the compensation settlement. Junie Novak was scheduled for heart valve replacement surgery on an April morning. In the 4th floor waiting hallway, Delia sat in the second chair from the window with both hands clasped together. Rocco Vitale sat 1 chair away from her, his back straight and his eyes fixed on the tile floor. And for 4 hours he counted those tiles, counting from his feet to the opposite wall and then backward again, over and over. Harriet sat at the other end of the hallway with a cup of coffee that had gone cold long before. No one spoke. Near noon, the double doors at the end of the hallway opened. A doctor stepped out, lowered his mask, and nodded. Delia Novak sprang to her feet, and Harriet Cobb wrapped her arms around her. Rocco Vitale remained seated with both hands on his knees, and he lowered his head for a very long time. 3 months later, he went to the state women's prison once, and only once. Renata Cardoni was brought out, sat down on the other side of the glass, and looked up at him. Rocco didn't sit. He stood there with his arms resting at his sides and said exactly 3 things. He said his father had made him promise to take care of Nico, and because of that promise, he would pay for Nico's 2 children to attend college until they graduated, whether Nico ever came out or not. He said she had never been included in anyone's promise. Then he said the final thing, that she must never knock on his door. He turned away and left, and he didn't look back. 1 year later, in Fall River, Massachusetts, there was a small 2-story house at the end of a quiet street, painted pale blue, with a low wooden fence and a front porch. It wasn't a mansion. It had no electric gate, no cameras, and no brass plaque on any gatepost. Delia Novak worked the night shift in the emergency department at the local hospital, and every evening before leaving home, she put on her white coat, tied her hair back with a rubber band, and slipped her feet into new nursing shoes. That evening, when she reached the end of the driveway, she looked back. The porch light was still glowing. A man sat on the step with both hands resting on his knees, and beside him lay a screwdriver because the screen door had come loose again. In the yard, an 8-year-old girl was running around the apple tree and counting aloud as she ran. 28, 29, 30. Then she didn't stop. She burst into laughter and kept counting. 31. 32, 33, running around again and again, reaching 50 before finally collapsing onto the grass in laughter, because now no one had to make her stop anymore. Delia Novak stood at the end of the driveway and looked toward that porch light for a long time. Then she turned away and whispered, almost too softly for anyone but herself to hear, that the truth had finally spoken louder than her tears. This story leaves us with several things worth thinking about. A sacrifice made for the wrong person doesn't save anyone. It only passes the bill to an innocent person and forces them to pay it instead. Trust is the most precious gift one human being can offer another, but we must look carefully at the person receiving it, because the one who betrays us is often the one sitting closest to us. Injustice may win for 3 years, 5 years, or 8 years, but the truth will always find a door left slightly open and make its way out. And forgiveness doesn't mean opening the door and allowing someone back into our lives, because a good person still has the right to protect their boundaries without becoming a victim one more time. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you love, so that every day you can have more meaningful stories to listen to. How did Delia and Rocco's story make you feel, and which part moved you the most? Please leave a few lines in the comments below, because we truly hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest places in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and many peaceful days beside your family. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.